Some nights, the hardest choice is between groceries and kindness. Daniel Brooks watched an elderly woman's heart medicine slip away as her card got declined for the third time, and his own empty wallet seemed to whisper all his fears about tomorrow. The single father had been counting every dollar since losing his job at the plant, working night shifts at the pharmacy just to keep his son in college. Eleanor Whitcombe stood there in her worn coat, apologizing softly as she prepared to leave without the pills that kept her alive. Daniel didn't think twice. He pulled out his last $40 and paid for her prescription. "Health first," he told her simply. The next morning, a black car pulled into his driveway. Eleanor stepped out, but she wasn't the same frail woman from the pharmacy. She had something to tell him, something that would explain why his kindness meant more than he could ever imagine. But what was Eleanor hiding that could change Daniel's life forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness of Daniel Brooks's modest two-bedroom home at 4:47 a.m., 3 minutes before he'd set it to ring. His internal clock had grown precise over the months of working double shifts. Body knew when survival demanded wakefulness. He silenced the alarm with a practiced swipe, careful not to disturb the photograph on his nightstand. Him and Aaron at last year's high school graduation, both grinning under Aaron's mortarboard, the boy's arms slung around his father's shoulders. Daniel's feet found the cold hardwood floor, a reminder that the heating bill had been another casualty of his careful budgeting. The house held the comfortable shabbiness of a home where love had filled the spaces that money couldn't reach. Mismatched furniture told stories of yard sales and necessity, but everything was clean, maintained with the same attention to detail Daniel had once brought to precision machinery at Witcom Manufacturing. In the kitchen, he moved through his morning ritual with quiet efficiency. Coffee, the good kind Aaron had given him for Christmas, though Daniel rationed it like liquid gold. 2 pieces of toast, butter scraped thin. The newspaper remained undelivered. That subscription had ended 4 months ago when the layoffs came. Instead, he glanced at Aaron's college acceptance letter, still magneted to the refrigerator despite being nearly a year old. State University's engineering program. Full-ride academic scholarship, thank God, though books and living expenses still stretched Daniel's resources to the breaking point. The sound of Aaron's bedroom door opening brought a smile to Daniel's weathered face. At 19, his son had inherited his mother's quick intelligence and Daniel's steady temperamental combination that had carried him through the grief of losing his mother at 12 and the uncertainty of their current circumstances with remarkable grace. "Morning, Dad." Aaron appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, wearing the Witcom Manufacturing t-shirt Daniel had brought home years ago. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The shirt bore the logo of the company that had laid Daniel off after 25 years of service. "Morning, son. You're up early for summer break." Aaron poured himself orange juice from the half-empty container, another careful purchase. "Thought I'd drive you to the pharmacy tonight, maybe grab dinner after your shift." Daniel felt the familiar tug of pride and concern. Aaron worked construction during the day back-breaking work for decent pay, but insisted on spending his evenings with his father rather than with friends his own age. The boy had grown up too fast, shouldering responsibilities that should have been Daniel's alone. "You don't need to do that. Save your gas money." "Dad," Aaron's voice carried gentle firmness, "it's dinner. Let me buy my old man a burger." The word "old" landed with particular weight. At 57, Daniel felt every year in his joints, especially his hands. Decades of working with steel and machinery had left their marked calluses that would never fade. A slight tremor in his left hand when he was tired, the kind of deep bone ache that came with rain. But Aaron meant it affectionately, and Daniel recognized the gesture for what it was. A son caring for his father with the same quiet determination Daniel had shown in raising him. "All right then, but we're splitting the check." Aaron grinned. "Deal." The morning passed in comfortable routine. Daniel tended to the small vegetable garden behind the house, tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that supplemented their grocery budget and gave him satisfaction that payrolls never could. His hands, scarred and steady, coaxed life from soil with the same precision they'd once brought to calibrating machinery. This was honest work too, just of a different kind. Aaron left for his construction job at 7, driving the 15-year-old Honda Civic that Daniel had bought, used and maintained with meticulous care. The car would need new tires, soon another expense to calculate and plan for. Daniel watched from the kitchen window as his son backed down the gravel driveway, noting the careful way Aaron avoided the worst potholes. The boy understood the value of making things last. The afternoon brought a rare moment of leisure. Daniel sat on the front porch, a cup of reheated coffee growing cold beside him as he sketched in a worn notebook. The drawings were technical mechanical designs, improvements to equipment he'd worked with, innovations that had never made it past his imagination. The sketches served no practical purpose now, but they kept his mind sharp and his hands busy. Mrs. Henderson from next door waved from her garden, and Daniel raised his coffee cup in return. Their neighborhood sat on the older side of Millbrook, where houses had been built for factory workers in the 1950s. Small, practical homes, with generous lots where families could grow vegetables and children could play safely in the streets. Most of his neighbors faced similar struggles: layoffs, reduced hours, the slow economic erosion that had transformed their community from thriving to merely surviving. Yet there remained a dignity in their persistence. Lawns stayed mowed, even if the mowers were old. Gardens produced vegetables that stretched grocery budgets. Neighbors helped neighbors with quiet consistency, sharing tools and advice and casseroles when someone faced particular hardship. Daniel had been the recipient of such kindness more than once, and he'd given it in return when he could. At 4:30, Daniel prepared for his shift at Millbrook Pharmacy. He'd taken the job 6 weeks after the layoff, swallowing his pride to ask Tom Morrison, the pharmacist, for work. Tom had known Daniel for years. They'd served together on the volunteer fire department and had created a position that didn't quite exist: evening stock clerk, customer service, and general problem solver. The work suited Daniel's temperament. He enjoyed helping customers find what they needed, especially the elderly residents who treated their pharmacy visits as social occasions. He'd learned the names of regular customers, their medications, their concerns. Mrs. Patterson worried about her diabetes. Mr. Patterson worried about her diabetes. Kowalski struggled with arthritis, but refused to admit it was slowing him down. Eleanor Whitcombe came in twice monthly for heart medication, always polite, always paying cash, always alone. Eleanor intrigued him. She possessed a quiet dignity that transcended her worn clothing and careful spending. Her voice carried the faint traces of an accent. Polish, perhaps, or Czech, that suggested stories he'd never heard. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone managing pain, but refusing to surrender to it. When she thanked him for his help, her eyes held genuine warmth, as if his small courtesies mattered more than they should. The pharmacy occupied a corner building in Millbrook's modest downtown, squeezed between a hardware store and a diner that had seen better decades. Tom Morrison ran it with old-fashioned attention to personal service, knowing his customers' names and families, extending credit when times were particularly hard, and staying open late for emergencies. It was exactly the kind of business that struggled against chain pharmacies and online ordering, surviving on loyalty and community connection. Daniel arrived for his shift to find Tom reviewing inventory behind the counter. The older man looked up with a smile that had weathered 30 years of small-town pharmacy work. "Evening, Daniel. Quiet night so far. Mrs. Chen picked up her prescription around 3, and Jimmy Kowalski's coming by after 6 for his father's medication. I'll watch for him." Daniel hung his jacket behind the counter and began his evening routine, checking stock, organizing displays, ensuring the store presented its best face to customers who had choices about where to spend their limited dollars. The work was methodical, satisfying in its completeness. Unlike the specialized tasks at the manufacturing plant, here Daniel could see the immediate impact of his efforts. A well-organized display helped customers find what they needed. A friendly greeting made someone's day slightly better. A willingness to carry heavy packages to elderly customers' cars built the kind of loyalty that kept small businesses alive. As evening settled over Millbrook, the pharmacy's fluorescent lights cast warm rectangles onto the sidewalk. Daniel restocked the pharmacy's modest selection of over-the-counter medications, arranged the seasonal items reading glasses, heating pads, the small conveniences that made daily life easier, and prepared for the steady trickle of customers who would arrive after dinner. This was his routine, his contribution, his way of earning the money that kept Aaron in college and their small family afloat. It wasn't the career he'd planned, or the life he'd imagined at 57, but it was honest work, performed with dignity and care. Some evenings that felt like enough. Other evenings, when the bills arrived faster than the paychecks and Aaron talked about deferring college to help with expenses, Daniel wondered if kindness and hard work were sufficient weapons against the grinding pressure of economic uncertainty. Tonight would prove that sometimes, when you least expect it, they are more than enough. The black town car appeared in Daniel's driveway at exactly 9:15 the next morning, as out of place in his neighborhood as a tuxedo at a barn raising. Daniel had been replacing a loose board on his front steps, another small maintenance task that kept his hands busy and his property respectable when the vehicle's quiet purr interrupted the suburban morning calm. Through the windshield, he could make out two figures, a driver in a dark suit, and in the passenger seat, the unmistakable silhouette of Eleanor Whitcombe. Daniel's first instinct was concern. Had something happened? Was she unwell? But as the car door opened and Eleanor emerged, he realized this wasn't a medical emergency. Eleanor stepped onto his gravel driveway wearing a wool coat that, while clearly well-made, had seen many seasons. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried herself with the careful dignity he'd observed at the pharmacy. But something was different. Her posture seemed straighter, her movements more purposeful, as if she'd shed some invisible burden overnight. "Mr. Brooks," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the small yard. "I hope you don't mind my coming by unannounced." Daniel set down his hammer and walked toward her, wiping his hands on his work pants. Up close, he noticed details that had escaped him in the pharmacy's harsh lighting, the quality of her shoes, the subtle elegance of her jewelry, the way she held herself despite her age. "Mrs. Whitcombe, good morning. Is everything all right? Your medication?" "The medication is fine, thanks to your kindness." She paused, studying his face with sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. "I've come to talk with you about something important. About yesterday, and about much more than yesterday." Daniel felt a flutter of unease. The town car, the formal visit, the weight in her voice of it, matched the elderly customer he'd helped without a second thought. "Would you like to come inside? I can make coffee." "That would be very kind." As they walked toward his front door, Daniel became acutely aware of his home's modest appearance. The paint was beginning to peel around the windows, the porch furniture was clean but clearly second-hand, and his garden, while tidy, spoke of necessity rather than luxury. He wondered what this well-dressed woman saw when she looked at his life. Inside, Eleanor's eyes moved over the living room with what seemed like approval rather than judgment. She noticed Aaron's academic awards on the mantelpiece, the carefully maintained furniture, the family photographs that spoke of love and loss and perseverance. "Your son?" she asked, nodding toward a recent photo of Aaron in his graduation cap and gown. "Aaron, he's 19, starting his second year of engineering at State University in the fall." Pride colored Daniel's voice despite his confusion about why Eleanor was here. "You must be very proud." "I am." Daniel gestured toward the kitchen. "Please have a seat. The coffee will just take a minute." As Daniel prepared the good coffee Aaron had given him, which seemed appropriate for such an unusual occasion, Eleanor settled at his small dining table. She removed her gloves with deliberate care, folding them precisely beside her purse. Her hands, Daniel noticed, bore the subtle signs of manual work, despite their current manicured appearance. "Mr. Brooks," Eleanor began, when Daniel returned with 2 steaming mugs. "What I'm about to tell you may come as quite a shock." Daniel sat across from her, his carpenter's instincts sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would change the comfortable routine of his life. "I'm listening." Eleanor lifted her coffee cup with both hands, as if drawing strength from its warmth. "Yesterday evening, after you so generously paid for my prescription, I went home and made some telephone calls. I wanted to learn more about the man who would spend his last $40 on a stranger's medicine." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "You investigated me?" "In a manner of speaking, yes." Eleanor's voice remained calm, but Daniel detected a tremor of nervousness. "What I discovered both surprised and deeply moved me. You worked for 25 years at Witcom Manufacturing. You were laid off 4 months ago when the company closed its main production facility. You've been working nights at the pharmacy to support your son's education." Daniel's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "Mrs. Whitcombe, I don't understand why you would—" "Because, Mr. Brooks, I am Eleanor Whitcombe, not just a customer with the same surname. I am the Eleanor Whitcombe who, along with my late husband Henry, founded Witcom Manufacturing 43 years ago." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He stared at the woman across from him, this elderly lady in her worn coat, who had struggled to pay for heart medication and tried to reconcile her with the shadowy figure he'd imagined running the company that had employed him for most of his adult life. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "The Whitcombes." He stopped, realizing he'd never actually seen the company's owners, had never thought much about them beyond the paychecks they provided and eventually took away. Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a leather folder. From it, she produced a business card-heavy stock, elegant typography, and slid it across the table. "Eleanor K. Whitcombe, Chairman of the Board, Witcom Manufacturing." Daniel picked up the card with trembling fingers. The company logo was familiar. He'd seen it on his paychecks, his work shirts, the machinery he'd operated for a quarter-century. But the name beneath it belonged to the woman who had stood in front of him last night, counting change for heart medication. "I don't understand," he said. "If you own the company, how could you not have money for—" "I carry cash for small purchases," Eleanor explained gently. "I've done so for decades. My husband believed it kept us connected to the value of money, reminded us not to lose touch with what things actually cost. Last night, I'd simply forgotten to visit the bank." Daniel's mind reeled. The layoffs, the plant closure, the months of uncertainty and struggle, all of it, had been decided by this woman who now sat in his kitchen, drinking his coffee and explaining herself as if they were old friends discussing the weather. "You closed the plant," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You put me out of work. You put hundreds of families out of work." Eleanor's face crumpled with genuine anguish. "Yes, and it was the hardest decision of my life. Henry would have found another way, he always did. But Henry died 5 years ago, and I've been trying to run the company with managers who care more about quarterly profits than about the people who make those profits possible." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "The board pressured me for months to close the main facility. They showed me reports, projections, market analyses that all pointed to the same conclusion. We were losing money, and the only way to save the company was to eliminate what they called redundant manufacturing capacity." Redundant. Daniel tasted the word like poison. 25 years of my life. Redundant. "Not to me," Eleanor said firmly. "Never to me. Do you know what I did after I got home last night, after I learned about your kindness? I stayed up until 3 in the morning, reading your employee file. 25 years of perfect attendance. Commendations for safety, for innovation, for training new workers. 3 separate recommendations for promotion that were somehow overlooked. You were exactly the kind of employee Henry and I dreamed of when we started this company." Daniel struggled to process the information. The woman who had destroyed his livelihood was praising his work ethic. The owner of the company that had discarded him was sitting in his kitchen, speaking of him with respect and regret. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Eleanor set down her coffee cup and looked directly into his eyes. "Because your act of kindness last night reminded me who I used to be, who Henry and I used to be. We started Witcom Manufacturing because we believed business could be a force for good in people's lives. We wanted to create jobs that paid well, treated workers with respect, and contributed something meaningful to the community." She gestured around Daniel's modest kitchen. "Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that vision. I let fear and financial pressure convince me to make decisions that Henry would never have approved. I closed the plant to save the company, but I realize now that I may have destroyed the very thing that made the company worth saving." Daniel remained silent, overwhelmed by the implications of what she was telling him. "I want to make this right," Eleanor continued. "Not just for you, though you deserve far better than what happened. I want to reopen part of the facility, create a program that combines traditional manufacturing with apprentice training, bring back experienced workers like you to mentor the next generation. Show the business world that treating people well isn't just morally right, it's financially smart." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "I want you to help me do it, Daniel. I want you to help me remember what Witcom Manufacturing was supposed to be." Daniel stared at the rusted gate of Witcom Manufacturing for a full minute before Eleanor's driver opened it with a key that seemed impossibly small for such a massive barrier. The factory complex stretched before them like a sleeping giant, 5 buildings connected by covered walkways, parking lots where weeds pushed through asphalt cracks, and the tall smokestack that had once announced the plant's vitality to the entire county. "I haven't been back since," Daniel's voice caught as memories flooded over him. The morning shift whistle that had regulated his life for 25 years. The satisfying rhythm of machinery operating in perfect harmony. The camaraderie of men and women who took pride in building things that would outlast them. Eleanor walked beside him, her steps measured and careful on the uneven pavement. She traded her wool coat for practical clothing, dark slacks, sturdy shoes, and a cardigan that looked expensive but comfortable. Her transformation from mysterious elderly woman to company owner was still jarring to Daniel, but he was beginning to see glimpses of the person she must have been in the company's early days. "Building 3, she said, pointing to a long, low structure with tall windows. "That's where we'll start. Henry always said it had the best natural light and the most flexible floor plan." Daniel pulled his old work badge from his Walletta habit he'd maintained, even after the layoff, carrying it like a talisman of better times. The plastic card bore his photo from 5 years ago, when his hair had been darker and his face less lined with worry. "Employee 2847, he murmured, reading the number that had defined his professional identity. "You remember your number?" Eleanor observed with something that might have been sadness. 25 years. You remember everything." They reached Building 3, and Eleanor produced another key. The lock turned with surprising ease, and the heavy door swung open to reveal a cavernous space filled with draped machinery and the particular silence that settles over abandoned places. Shafts of morning sunlight cut through the dusty air, illuminating the ghostly shapes of equipment Daniel knew as well as his own hands. "The lathes are still here," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. He walked toward a covered machine, pulled away the protective tarp, and revealed a precision lathe he'd operated for the final 5 years of his employment. His hands moved automatically to the controls, muscle memory guiding fingers to switches and adjustment knobs. Eleanor watched him with intense interest. Could it be restored to working condition? Daniel ran his hand along the machine's surface, feeling for the telltale signs of neglect or damage. The bearings need attention, and the electronics should be checked, but the basic machine is sound. Henry bought quality equipment. He insisted on it. Buy the best, maintain it properly, and it will serve you for decades. That was his philosophy. As they moved deeper into the building, Daniel's expertise became apparent. He pointed out which machines would need major overhauls, which could be quickly restored, and which should probably be replaced entirely. His knowledge wasn't just technical, understood the relationships between different pieces of equipment, how workflow patterns could be optimized, where safety improvements could be implemented. "You're thinking like a manager," Eleanor observed after Daniel had outlined a potential restoration sequence that would minimize downtime and maximize efficiency. "Thinking like a craftsman," Daniel corrected. "Management never seemed to understand that the people who operate the machines usually know them better than anyone else." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Henry used to say the same thing. The board never appreciated that perspective." They spent the next hour exploring the facility, and Daniel found himself caught between profound sadness and growing excitement. The sadness came from seeing his former workplace reduced to dust and silence. The excitement came from recognizing the potential that still existed within these walls, the possibility of resurrection, of purpose restored. "There's something else I want to show you," Eleanor said, leading him to a smaller building connected to the main manufacturing floor. "Henry's office. I've kept it exactly as it was." The office occupied a corner space with windows overlooking the factory floor. Unlike the executive offices Daniel had glimpsed during his rare visits to the administrative building, this space was clearly designed for someone who spent time among the machinery. The desk was solid but practical, the chairs comfortable rather than impressive, and the walls were covered with technical drawings, production schedules, and photographs of employees receiving safety awards or celebrating work anniversaries. "He managed from here," Eleanor explained. "Said he couldn't make good decisions about manufacturing if he couldn't see and hear what was actually happening on the floor." Daniel studied a photograph of Henry Whitcombe, a man in his 60s, with intelligent eyes and calloused hands, standing next to a machine Daniel recognized. "I remember him. He came through the floor regularly, asked good questions, actually listened to the answers. That was Henry. He never forgot that he started as a machinist himself." On Henry's desk, Daniel noticed a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. Eleanor saw his interest and nodded. His notes on running the business. He wrote something almost every day for 40 years, observations about employees, ideas for improvements, thoughts about what the company should become. She opened the journal to a random page and read, "A business that doesn't serve its workers ultimately serves no one. Profit that comes at the expense of human dignity is profit stolen from the future." Daniel felt something shift inside him, a recognition that the opportunity Eleanor was offering might be more than just a job or even a career. It might be a chance to honor the vision of a man who had understood that business could be about more than balance sheets. "Who else knows about your plans?" he asked. "No one yet. I wanted to talk with you first, see if the idea made sense from an operational standpoint." Eleanor closed the journal and looked directly at him. "I need someone I can trust, someone who understands both the technical aspects and the human elements of what we're trying to accomplish." Daniel thought about Aaron, who would be thrilled at the prospect of his father returning to meaningful work. He thought about his former colleagues, scattered to various jobs throughout the county, many of them struggling just as he had been. He thought about the satisfaction of seeing silent machines return to productive life. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "The equipment restoration alone will take months. Finding qualified workers, setting up training programs, dealing with regulatory requirements, there are 1,000 details that could go wrong." Eleanor smiled. "Henry used to say that anything worth doing was complicated. Simple problems already have simple solutions." Daniel walked to the window and looked out over the factory floor, imagining it filled with purposeful activity once again. Young apprentices learning alongside experienced craftsmen. The rhythm of productive work, replacing the silence of abandonment. A place where making things well mattered more than making them cheaply. "I'll need to bring in some of my former colleagues for consultation," he said. "People who know these machines, understand the workflows. Of course, this isn't something one person can accomplish alone." Daniel turned back to Eleanor, decision crystallizing in his mind. "Then yes, I'll help you bring this place back to life." Eleanor's smile was the first truly joyful expression he'd seen from her. "Henry would have liked you very much, Daniel. I think you would have liked him too." The portrait of Henry Whitcombe dominated the wall behind Eleanor's kitchen table, painted in oils that captured both the strength in his weathered hands and the kindness in his eyes. Daniel found himself studying it as Eleanor prepared lunch in her modest, homey-tidy ranch house that could have belonged to any retired couple in Millbrook, except for the subtle signs of substantial wealth carefully hidden throughout. "He was 73 when that was painted," Eleanor said, following Daniel's gaze. 2 years before he died. The artist wanted to make him look more distinguished, but Henry insisted on being shown exactly as he was, work clothes, calloused hands, and all. Daniel accepted the cup of tea Eleanor offered, noting the fine china that seemed at odds with her careful spending at the pharmacy. The contradiction was beginning to make sense. Eleanor Whitcombe had been raised with an understanding that true wealth wasn't displayed, but preserved, that comfort came from security rather than ostentation. "Tell me about the beginning," Daniel said. "How did two people start a manufacturing company from nothing?" Eleanor settled across from him, her eyes growing distant with memory. "Henry came to this country with his parents when he was 12,952, from Poland. His father was a metal worker, and Henry learned the trade working in his father's small shop after school. I arrived 5 years later with my family. We were Czech, fleeing the communist takeover." She paused to sip her tea, collecting thoughts that spanned decades. "We met at a church social when I was 19 and he was 24. He was working at the foundry by then, saving every penny he could. I was taking night classes in bookkeeping, determined to make something of myself in America." Daniel could see the young woman Eleanor had been determined, practical, unafraid of hard work. The same qualities that had built a company were evident in how she maintained her home, managed her affairs, and approached problems with systematic thoroughness. "We married in 1963, Eleanor continued. "Henry had this dream of starting his own shop, building parts for the automotive industry. The problem was, capital banks weren't eager to lend money to Polish immigrants with big ideas and small bank accounts. How did you manage it?" Eleanor smiled, an expression that transformed her face entirely. "We sold everything we owned, including my engagement ring. Henry's father contributed his life savings. My parents gave us their blessing and the $200 they'd hidden in a coffee can for emergencies. We found an abandoned garage on the outskirts of town and convinced the owner to rent it to us for $25 a month." The story unfolded like a familiar American dream, but Eleanor's telling emphasized the daily struggles rather than the ultimate triumph. Those first years had been marked by 18-hour workdays, meals of bread and soup, and constant worry about meeting payroll for the 3 employees they'd managed to hire. Henry worked the machines while I handled the books, the customers, and everything else that needed doing. We lived in a 1-room apartment above the shop for the first 3 years, falling asleep to the sound of machinery and waking up to the smell of cutting oil. Daniel could picture it clearly, the young couple pouring their lives into building something that would outlast them, driven by the immigrants' hunger for security and the craftsman's pride in quality work. It explained Eleanor's genuine understanding of what the plant closure had meant to families like his own. "The breakthrough came in 1968, Eleanor said. "Ford awarded us a contract for transmission components. Suddenly we needed more space, more equipment, more workers. Henry insisted on profit sharing from the beginning, he said. The people who built our success should benefit from it. That was unusual for the time. Very unusual. The business advisors thought we were crazy, but Henry had worked for other people long enough to know what it felt like to watch owners get rich while workers stayed poor. He was determined our company would be different." Eleanor rose to check something in the oven, and Daniel noticed how she moved efficiently, without wasted motion, someone accustomed to managing multiple tasks simultaneously. When she returned, she carried a photograph album thick with memories. "These are from the early years," she said, opening to pages of black and white photos. Henry insisted on documenting everything: the equipment installations, the first major orders, every employee who joined the company. Daniel studied the pictures with fascination. Young Henry, tall and serious, standing next to machinery that Daniel recognized as predecessors to the equipment he'd operated decades later. Eleanor, barely 30, in a simple dress and apron, working at a desk covered with invoices and orders. Groups of employees, mostly men but some women, all wearing the expressions of people who understood they were part of something special. "This one," Eleanor said, pointing to a photo from what appeared to be a company picnic, was taken in 1975, 27 employees and their families. Henry knew everyone's name, their children's ages, what they dreamed of accomplishing. The personal attention hadn't been a management technique, but a genuine reflection of Henry's character. Eleanor showed Daniel more photos: Christmas parties held in the factory, safety award ceremonies, retirement celebrations that lasted entire weekends. The company had been built on relationships as much as contracts. "What changed?" Daniel asked. "When did it become just another business?" Eleanor's expression grew troubled. Gradually, then suddenly. Henry's first heart attack in 1995 forced him to step back from daily operations. "We hired professional managers, MBA graduates, with impressive credentials and modern ideas about efficiency and competitiveness." She turned to a page of color photographs from the company's later years. The faces were less familiar, the settings more formal, the sense of family connection noticeably diminished. "They weren't bad people," Eleanor said carefully, "but they looked at numbers instead of faces. They talked about human resources instead of workers, about cost centers instead of livelihoods." Henry tried to maintain the personal connections, but as his health declined, more decisions fell to managers who had never worked with their hands or worried about meeting a mortgage payment. Daniel understood the transformation she was describing. He'd witnessed it firsthand during his final years at the plant: the gradual shift from a company that cared about its workers to one that simply employed them. "After Henry died, I should have taken a more active role," Eleanor admitted, "but I was grieving, and the managers assured me they were following his principles. By the time I realized how far we'd drifted from his vision, the financial pressures were enormous, and the solutions seemed to require exactly the kind of harsh decisions Henry would have rejected." "That's why you want to restore the plant," Daniel said, understanding dawning. "Not just to create jobs, but to recreate what you and Henry built originally." Eleanor nodded, her eyes returning to Henry's portrait. "I want to prove that his way still works, that treating people well isn't just morally right, it's good business. That companies can profit while serving something larger than themselves." She looked directly at Daniel. "But I can't do it alone. I need someone who understands both Henry's vision and the practical realities of modern manufacturing. Someone the workers will trust and respect." Daniel felt the weight of her expectations and the opportunity they represented. This wasn't just about his own employment or even Aaron's future. It was about validating a way of doing business that honored human dignity alongside financial success. "When do we start?" he asked. The vintage lathe hummed to life with a deep, satisfying purr that seemed to echo through Building 3 like a declaration of purpose. Daniel's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, adjusting feed rates and spindle speeds, while Aaron watched with the focused attention of someone witnessing something profound. "Listen to that," Daniel said, his voice carrying a reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces. "When Henry bought this machine in 1978, it was the finest precision lathe money could buy. 47 years later, properly maintained, it's still better than most of what they make today." The restoration had taken 3 weeks of careful work, cleaning decades of accumulated grime, replacing worn bearings, recalibrating the electronic controls that had been added over the years. But the machine's fundamental structure, its cast iron bones and steel sinews, had proven as solid as the day it left the factory. Aaron ran his fingers along the freshly painted surface, feeling the subtle vibrations that indicated everything was running in perfect harmony. "It's like bringing something back from the dead." "Not back from the dead," Eleanor corrected from where she stood, watching nearby, notebook in hand as always. These machines were never dead, just sleeping, waiting for someone to remember their value. The three of them had fallen into a comfortable working relationship over the past month. Daniel provided the technical expertise and leadership that came naturally after 25 years in manufacturing. Eleanor offered historical perspective and the quiet authority of ownership, along with a seemingly endless capacity for detailed planning. Aaron contributed youthful energy and the fresh perspective of someone approaching the work without preconceived limitations. The building itself had been transformed. What had been a dusty mausoleum of abandoned equipment was becoming a working shop again. Windows had been cleaned until they sparkled, letting natural light flood the workspace. The concrete floors had been scrubbed and sealed. Electrical systems had been updated to current safety standards while preserving the industrial character that made the space feel authentic. But the real transformation was in the people the project was attracting. Word had spread through Millbrook's network of former Witcom employees, and Daniel found himself fielding calls from men and women eager to be part of whatever Eleanor was planning. Marcus Washington called this morning. Daniel told Eleanor as they watched Aaron practice basic operations on the restored lathe. He wants to know if we're serious about bringing people back. Marcus had been Daniel's shift supervisor for 8 years, a man whose knowledge of metal fabrication was matched only by his ability to teach complex procedures to newcomers. His layoff had been particularly bitter because he'd been just 3 years from retirement, too old to start over somewhere else, but too young to stop working entirely. "What did you tell him?" Eleanor asked. "That we're serious, but we're also being careful. That we want to do this right rather than fast." Eleanor nodded approvingly. Henry always said that hiring the wrong person quickly was worse than taking time to find the right person. What about the others? The others were the small group of former employees who had begun gathering informally at the plant site, drawn by curiosity and hope in equal measure. Tommy Kowalski, whose arthritis hadn't prevented him from offering detailed advice on machinery maintenance. Sarah Chen, who had managed quality control for 15 years and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of manufacturing standards. Bill Morrison, a welder whose artistic eye had elevated functional metalwork to something approaching sculpture. "They're ready," Daniel said simply. "More than ready. Most of them are working jobs that pay half what they made here, doing work that doesn't use a tenth of their skills." Aaron looked up from the lathe controls. How many people could the program eventually employ? Directly, maybe 40 or 50 workers once we're fully operational, Eleanor calculated. But the real impact would be broader suppliers, maintenance contractors, the businesses in town that depend on workers having decent paychecks to spend. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small delegation, Marcus Washington, Tommy Kowalski, and Sarah Chen, all wearing expressions of cautious optimism. Daniel had invited them to see the restored lathe and discuss the program's potential scope. Marcus approached the running machine with something approaching reverence. "I helped install this beauty back in '78. Thought I'd never hear it run again." Tommy examined the restoration work with a critical eye that missed nothing. "Somebody knows what they're doing. This isn't just cleaned up, it's been properly rebuilt." Sarah was more interested in the broader implications. "What exactly are you planning here, Mrs. Whitcombe? Are we talking about a few restored machines for show, or are we talking about real manufacturing?" Eleanor had prepared for this question. Real manufacturing, precision components for automotive and aerospace customers, but also something more, a training program that pairs experienced workers like you with young apprentices, a place where institutional knowledge gets passed down instead of lost. The three visitors exchanged glances that conveyed years of shared experience and mutual trust. These were people who had worked together through good times and bad, who understood each other's capabilities and limitations. "Training program," Marcus repeated thoughtfully. "You mean like Aaron here?" "Aaron and others like him. Young people who want to learn skilled trades but can't afford traditional technical schools. Kids from families where college isn't an option, but intelligence and dedication are abundant. Tommy brightened at the concept. My grandson Jimmy, he's got good hands and a good mind, but he's been struggling to find direction since high school. Something like this could change his life. That's exactly what we're hoping for, Daniel said. Experienced craftsmen mentoring the next generation, knowledge preservation combined with skills development. Sarah was characteristically practical. What about markets? You can't run a manufacturing operation without customers. Eleanor smiled. Henry's old contacts are still valid. The automotive industry needs precision components, and there's growing demand for custom work that requires exactly the kind of expertise you people possess. Plus, there's something to be said for the Made in America brand, especially when it comes with a story about bringing manufacturing back to small towns. Aaron had been listening intently to the adult conversation. What about people my age who aren't sure what they want to do? Could the program help us figure that out? That's one of the most important aspects, Eleanor replied. Not everyone is cut out for manufacturing, but everyone deserves the chance to discover what they're good at. We'd have rotations through different areas: machining, welding, quality control, even basic business operations. Marcus nodded slowly. It could work. The question is whether there's still a market for the kind of quality we use to produce. There's always a market for quality, Eleanor said firmly. The challenge is competing with companies that prioritize cost over craftsmanship. But there are customers who understand that buying cheap often means buying twice. Daniel watched the conversation with growing excitement. These were his people, skilled, experienced, proud of their work, and they were beginning to believe that Eleanor's vision could become reality. The restored lathe continued its steady operation, providing a soundtrack of purposeful productivity that seemed to underscore every word. So what's the next step? Sarah asked. Eleanor consulted her ever-present notebook. Daniel and I need to develop a detailed business plan. You three need to think about which other former employees might be interested in joining the program. And all of us need to start thinking about what we want this place to become, not just what it used to be, but what it could be. As the group dispersed, each carrying homework assignments and renewed hope, Daniel remained behind with the running lathe. The machine's steady operation had become a kind of meditation, a reminder that good work continued regardless of economic upheavals or corporate decisions. Aaron approached him as the others left. Dad, this could really happen, couldn't it? Daniel looked at his son, 19 years old, standing on the threshold of adulthood, eager to be part of something meaningful. Yes, son, I think it really could. Eleanor's garden gloves lay on Daniel's kitchen table like artifacts from another era-soft leather, worn smooth by years of careful use, fingertips darkened by soil and time. She'd arrived that morning carrying a basket of tomatoes from her own garden, insisting that Daniel and Aaron needed fresh vegetables to supplement their careful grocery shopping. My grandmother taught me that hands tell the true story of a person's life, Eleanor said, flexing her fingers before pulling on the gloves. These have planted thousands of seedlings, pulled weeds through 40 summers, and helped build a company that employed half this town. Aaron looked up from the engineering textbook he'd been studying at the kitchen table. Over the past 2 months, Eleanor had become a regular presence in their home, sometimes arriving with vegetables, sometimes with old photographs or documents from the company's early years, always with stories that bridged the gap between past and present. Mrs. Whitcombe, Aaron said, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about deferring college for a year to work in the apprenticeship program. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. They'd discussed this before, and while he understood Aaron's enthusiasm for the restoration project, the thought of his son delaying his education triggered every parental fear about lost opportunities and closed doors. Eleanor settled into her usual chair, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing arthritis but refusing to surrender to it. Tell me what you're thinking. The program won't be the same without someone from my generation involved from the beginning, Aaron said, his words coming faster as his excitement built. And honestly, I'm not sure college is teaching me what I actually need to know about making things, about solving real problems with my hands. Aaron, Daniel began, but Eleanor raised a gentle hand. Let him finish. Aaron looked between his father and Eleanor, gathering courage to voice thoughts he'd been wrestling with for weeks. College will always be there. But what we're building together, this is happening now. And if I'm really going to be an engineer, shouldn't I understand how things are actually made? Shouldn't I know what it feels like to operate the machines I'll be designing for? Eleanor removed her gloves and folded them carefully. Your father sacrificed a great deal to ensure you could go to college. That sacrifice matters, and it shouldn't be dismissed lightly. I'm not dismissing it, Aaron said quickly. I'm trying to honor it by making sure my education means something real. Daniel studied his son's face, recognizing the stubborn determination that had carried the boy through his mother's illness and death, through the uncertain months after the layoff, through all the challenges that had shaped him into someone older than his 19 years. What does the university say about deferring? Daniel asked, resigned to taking the conversation seriously. They'll hold my spot for up to 2 years, especially since I'm planning to gain work experience related to my field of study. Eleanor leaned forward, her business instincts engaged. And what would you want to accomplish during that year? Aaron pulled out a notebook. He'd inherited Eleanor's habit of documenting everything and opened to pages covered with detailed plans. 6 months learning basic machining, welding, and assembly processes. 6 months working with you and Dad on program development, curriculum design, apprentice recruitment, maybe even some of the business planning. Daniel felt pride and worry warring in his chest. The plan demonstrated remarkable maturity, but it also represented a departure from the safe path he'd worked so hard to secure for his son. There's something else, Aaron continued. Jimmy Kowalski talked to me yesterday. His family can't afford to send him to trade school, but he's desperate to learn skilled work. If I defer college to join the apprenticeship program, he sees it as validation that the training is worth something. Peer influence works both ways, Eleanor observed. Other young people might be more willing to consider skilled trades if they see someone college-bound choosing to learn those skills first. Daniel walked to the window and looked out at the small garden where Eleanor had spent the morning helping him plant winter vegetables. The sight of this wealthy woman kneeling in his soil, her expensive shoes forgotten as she worked alongside him, had forced him to reconsider many of his assumptions about success and values. "What do you think, Eleanor?" he asked finally. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the kitchen table. "I think there are different kinds of education and different kinds of success. Henry never went to college, but he understood engineering principles better than most people with degrees. I never studied business formally, but I helped build a company that lasted 40 years. She looked directly at Aaron. College will teach you theories and concepts, which are valuable. But working with your hands will teach you how materials behave, how machines think, how solutions emerge from understanding problems deeply rather than just analytically." Aaron leaned forward eagerly. "So you think it's a good idea?" "I think it's a serious decision that deserves careful consideration," Eleanor replied. "But I also think the best engineers I've known were people who understood manufacturing from the ground up." Daniel returned to the table, decision crystallizing in his mind. If you defer college, you commit to the full year. No changing your mind after 3 months because the work is harder than you expected. I commit, and you continue studying on your own. Mathematics, physics, reading technical literature. The year shouldn't be a vacation from learning. Absolutely. And we establish clear goals for what you'll accomplish, with regular check-ins to ensure you're meeting them. Aaron nodded enthusiastically. I can work with that. Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face completely. Henry would have loved this conversation. He always said the best way to understand something was to build it yourself. Over the next hour, the three of them developed a preliminary plan for Aaron's gap year. Mornings would be spent in hands-on training with Daniel and the other experienced workers. Afternoons would be devoted to program development, helping Eleanor create curriculum and recruit other young apprentices. Evenings would be reserved for continued academic study, ensuring Aaron remained prepared for his eventual return to university. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said as the conversation wound down. "The corporate executives have been asking questions about my increased activity at the plant. They're not openly opposed to the restoration project, but they're concerned about resources being diverted from more profitable ventures." Daniel felt a chill of concern. What kind of questions? Financial projections, market analysis, return on investment calculations. The kind of questions that assume every business decision should be justified purely by short-term profit potential. "And what do you tell them?" Eleanor's smile carried a hint of steel. "I tell them it's my company, and some decisions are made for reasons that don't appear on balance sheets." Aaron looked between the two adults, sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. "Are they going to try to stop the project?" "They might try," Eleanor admitted, "which is why we need to move forward deliberately but quickly. The more progress we make, the harder it becomes for anyone to dismiss what we're accomplishing as an elderly woman's whim." Daniel reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hand, with his own a gesture that surprised him with its naturalness. "We won't let that happen." Eleanor turned her hand to clasp his briefly. "I know. That's why I asked for your help in the first place." As Eleanor prepared to leave, gathering her empty basket and pulling on her garden gloves, Aaron spoke up one final time. "Mrs. Whitcombe, thank you for believing that this project is worth delaying college for." Eleanor paused at the door, her expression serious. "Aaron, I'm not asking you to delay your education. I'm asking you to begin it in a different way." There's a difference, and it matters. After she left, Daniel and Aaron sat in comfortable silence, both processing the weight of the decision they'd just made. Outside, autumn was settling over Millbrook, and the early evening light cast long shadows across their small yard. "Dad," Aaron said finally, "do you think we're doing the right thing?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "I think we're doing something worthwhile. Whether it's right or wrong, we'll find out together." The corporate buyout documents arrived on a Tuesday morning when Eleanor was elbow-deep in machinery grease, working alongside Daniel to install a refurbished milling machine. The manila envelope bore the letterhead of Hastings, Associates, Attorneys at Law, and its contents would threaten to destroy everything they'd built together over the past 3 months. Daniel noticed Eleanor's face drain of color as she read the legal papers, her hands trembling slightly as she turned each page. The restoration project had been proceeding beyond their most optimistic projection site machines, operational, 12 former employees back to work part-time, and Aaron leading a group of 5 young apprentices through their first month of training. "What is it?" Daniel asked, setting down his wrench. Eleanor sank onto a nearby workbench, the papers scattered around her like fallen leaves. "The board of directors is attempting a hostile takeover. They're claiming I've become incompetent to manage the company's interests due to what they're calling frivolous expenditures and questionable business decisions." Aaron looked up from where he'd been teaching Jimmy Kowalski the basics of precision measurement. The young men had become fast friends, bonding over their shared enthusiasm for learning skills their grandfathers had taken for granted. "Can they do that?" Aaron asked. "Legally, yes," Eleanor replied, her voice hollow. "When Henry and I restructured the company 20 years ago, we created a board with oversight authority, specifically to prevent any single person, even the founder, from making decisions that could endanger the business." Daniel studied the documents, his anger building, as he read the specific accusations. The board claimed Eleanor's restoration hobby had diverted nearly $200,000 from productive investments. They cited her erratic behavior in personally involving herself with day-to-day operations rather than focusing on strategic oversight. Most damaging, they presented financial projections showing the restoration project would never generate sufficient revenue to justify its costs. "This is about the pharmacy, isn't it?" Daniel said, a terrible realization dawning. "They know about that night." Eleanor's silence confirmed his suspicion. The story he'd hoped to keep private, The simple act of kindness that had started everything had somehow reached the boardroom and been twisted into evidence of Eleanor's supposed decline in judgment. "How?" he asked. "I don't know, but someone has been investigating both of us very thoroughly." Eleanor pointed to a section of the documents that made Daniel's stomach clench. "They know about your financial situation, Aaron's college plans, even the specific amount you paid for my prescription." The invasion of privacy felt like a physical violation, but worse was the implication. Eleanor's interest in the restoration project was being characterized as the manipulation of a vulnerable employee rather than a genuine business initiative. Aaron had moved closer to read over Daniel's shoulder. "They're making it sound like Mrs. Whitcombe took advantage of you, Dad." "Worse than that," Daniel said grimly. "They're suggesting I took advantage of her. Look at this paragraph. They're claiming I deliberately orchestrated the pharmacy incident to gain access to a wealthy, elderly woman." The accusation was so far from the truth that it seemed almost laughable, except for its potential consequences. If the board succeeded in painting their relationship as exploitation rather than partnership, Eleanor could lose control of the company she'd helped build, and Daniel could face criminal charges. "There's more," Eleanor said quietly, turning to the final pages. "They've been monitoring my activities for months. They know about every visit to your home, every dinner we've shared, every moment I've spent working on the factory floor rather than in the executive offices." Daniel felt the careful world they'd constructed beginning to crumble. The restoration project had given him purpose beyond mere employment. It had offered the chance to honor craftsmanship, to mentor young people, to prove that business could serve human dignity alongside profit. Now it was all threatened by corporate executives who saw relationships only in terms of liability and manipulation. "What's their endgame?" he asked. Eleanor consulted the documents one final time. "They want to remove me from operational control and install Richard Hastings, the lawyer's son, as interim CEO. The restoration project would be terminated immediately, with all equipment sold to recoup what they consider wasted investment. And the workers? Laid off again, permanently this time." Aaron looked around the bustling workshop where Marcus Washington was training 2 apprentices on safety protocols, while Sarah Chen explained quality control standards to another group. The space hummed with purposeful activity, filled with people who had rediscovered meaning in their work. "We can't let this happen," Aaron said. "I'm not sure we have a choice," Eleanor replied. "The board has legal authority, and I've provided them with exactly the ammunition they need. An elderly woman making emotional decisions rather than business decisions, spending company money on personal projects, forming inappropriate relationships with former employees." Daniel felt anger replace his initial shock. Inappropriate relationships. We're trying to save people's livelihoods. We're preserving institutional knowledge. We're training the next generation of skilled workers. I know that. You know that. But from their perspective, we're wasting money on good projects that don't generate immediate returns. The 3 of them sat in silence, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd accomplished and the threat to its continuation. The restored machines continued their steady operation, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around them. "There's something else," Eleanor said finally. "Something I should have told you earlier, but I was afraid it would change how you saw our partnership." Daniel's heart sank. More revelations, more complications to an already impossible situation. "The night you paid for my prescription, it wasn't entirely coincidental that I was there. I'd been coming to the pharmacy for months, watching you work, observing how you treated customers, especially the elderly ones who reminded me of my parents' generation." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. "You were investigating me." "Not investigating. Observing. After Henry died, I felt so disconnected from the company, from the community we'd tried to serve. I started visiting places where I could see ordinary people being kind to each other, the pharmacy, the diner, the hardware store. You stood out because you consistently went beyond what your job required." Daniel struggled to process this information. The spontaneous act of generosity that had started their relationship had been based on Eleanor's deliberate observation of his character. Did that make it less genuine? More calculated? So when my card was declined, I genuinely forgot to go to the bank. That part was completely real. But yes, I'd been hoping for an opportunity to see what kind of person you really were when someone needed help. Aaron looked between his father and Eleanor, confusion evident on his face. Does this change anything? Daniel considered the question seriously. Eleanor's observation of him had been methodical, but her gratitude for his help had been genuine. Her proposal to restore the plant had been calculated, but her commitment to the workers had been real. The complexity didn't negate the value of what they'd built together. It changes how it started, Daniel said finally, but it doesn't change what we've accomplished or what we're trying to do. Eleanor's relief was visible. I was afraid you'd feel manipulated. I feel many things right now, but manipulated isn't one of them. Frustrated, yes. Angry at the board, definitely, but not manipulated. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the factory floor, where Jimmy Kowalski was carefully operating the lathe under Aaron's supervision. The young man's concentration was absolute, his movements gaining confidence with each successful operation. The question is, what do we do now? Eleanor joined him at the window. Fight back. We have 3 weeks before the board meets to vote on the takeover. 3 weeks to demonstrate that what we're doing here isn't frivolous spending, but essential investment. How? By proving that the restoration project isn't just about nostalgia or charity, it's about creating sustainable value. We need customers, contracts, revenue projections that show we can compete in today's market. Aaron approached them, his young face set with determination. And if we can't prove that in 3 weeks, Eleanor's voice was quiet but steady, then we lose everything, the company, the project, and quite possibly each other. The weight of the challenge settled over them like a heavy blanket. 3 weeks to save not just a business venture, but a vision of what work could be when it honored both profit and human dignity. Then we'd better get started, Daniel said. Henry Whitcomb's business journal lay open on Eleanor's kitchen table, its yellowed pages revealing secrets that could save or damn everything they'd worked to build. Daniel sat across from Eleanor in the pre-dawn darkness, both of them sustained by strong coffee and the desperate energy that comes from having everything on the line. Listen to this, Eleanor said, her finger tracing lines written in Henry's careful handwriting 40 years earlier. The board believes our profit-sharing program is financially irresponsible, but they fail to understand that workers who share in success work harder to create it. Yesterday's production numbers prove the point quality up 12%, waste down 18%, all because people care about the outcome. Daniel looked up from the legal documents he'd been studying. He faced the same pressure from the board? Constantly. Every innovation Henry wanted to implement, every worker-friendly policy, every investment in equipment or training the board, questioned it all on purely financial grounds. Eleanor turned several pages, seeking specific entries. Here in 1983. Board meeting today nearly ended in revolt when I proposed the apprenticeship program. They see only the immediate costs, not the long-term value of skilled workers who understand our standards and stay with the company for decades. The irony was profound. The very program they were trying to recreate had faced identical opposition from predecessors of the current board members. History was repeating itself with devastating precision. Aaron entered the kitchen, already dressed for work despite the early hour. Over the past week, he'd thrown himself into the restoration project with an intensity that worried Daniel. The young man was working 16-hour days, determined to prove that the apprenticeship program could produce immediate, measurable results. "Any luck with the contracts?" Aaron asked, pouring himself coffee. Daniel consulted his notebook, where he'd been tracking their frantic efforts to secure paying customers. Morrison Automotive is interested in our transmission housing proposal, but they need a full production run of 500 units to make it worthwhile. Peterson Aerospace wants to see samples before they'll commit to anything. Timeline? That's the problem. Morrison needs delivery within 6 weeks. Peterson wants samples in 10 days. Either timeline is aggressive for a startup operation. Eleanor closed Henry's journal and looked between Daniel and Aaron. We're trying to accomplish in 3 weeks what took Henry and me 3 years originally. The difference is we're starting with experienced workers and restored equipment instead of building from nothing. But we're also working under corporate scrutiny that Henry never faced, Daniel pointed out. Every expenditure, every decision, every hour we spend has to be justified to people who've already decided we're wasting their money. The past week had been a blur of activity. Daniel had contacted every former colleague he could reach, asking them to work extended hours for deferred pay while they pursued contracts that might never materialize. Eleanor had liquidated personal investments to cover immediate expenses, gambling her own financial security on the project's success. Aaron had recruited additional apprentices, expanding their workforce at exactly the moment when their funding was most precarious. The results were encouraging but insufficient. They'd restored 12 machines to full operational status. Quality control systems were functioning perfectly. The apprentices were progressing faster than anyone had expected, with Jimmy Kowalski already operating equipment with near-professional competence. But none of that mattered if they couldn't demonstrate immediate profitability to a board that measured success in quarterly returns rather than human development. "There's something else in Henry's journal," Eleanor said, opening to a page near the back. "Something I'd forgotten until now. In 1987, when the board tried to force him to eliminate the apprenticeship program, Henry made a presentation that changed their minds. He called it the true cost of quality, and it demonstrated that skilled workers actually generated more profit than cheaper alternatives." Daniel leaned forward with interest. "Do you have a copy of that presentation?" "Better than that. I have his research notes, his calculations, and his conclusions. The same arguments he made 37 years ago might be exactly what we need today." Aaron set down his coffee cup. "What did he prove?" Eleanor consulted the journal entry. That apprentice-trained workers stayed with the company an average of 15 years, compared to 3 years for workers hired from outside. That they had lower accident rates, higher productivity, and better problem-solving skills. That the total cost per productive worker year was actually lower for apprentices despite the initial training investment. And the board accepted that? Not immediately, but Henry had documentation production records, safety statistics, retention rates, everything quantified and verified. The board couldn't argue with numbers that demonstrated clear financial benefit. Daniel felt the first stirring of real hope in days. "We have the same data, maybe not 15 years worth, but we have objective measures of quality, efficiency, and worker satisfaction. Plus," Aaron added, "we have something Henry didn't have: modern manufacturing techniques combined with traditional craftsmanship. We can produce higher quality work faster than anyone expected." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, where dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. "The board meeting is Monday. Today is Wednesday. That gives us 5 days to compile data, create a presentation, and secure at least one major contract that demonstrates immediate viability." 5 days, Daniel repeated, "to save everything we've built. 5 days to prove that Henry's vision still works in today's economy." They spent the next hour developing a strategy that seemed simultaneously logical and impossible. Daniel would focus on securing the Morrison automotive contract, even if it meant guaranteeing delivery schedules that pushed their capabilities to the limit. Eleanor would compile Henry's historical data and combine it with their current performance metrics to create an irrefutable business case. Aaron would coordinate with the apprentices to produce sample components for Peterson Aerospace, demonstrating quality that justified their premium pricing. As they prepared to leave for the factory, Eleanor pulled Daniel aside. "There's something I need you to understand," she said quietly. "If we lose on Monday, I lose control of the company. But you and Aaron could face much worse consequences." "What do you mean?" "The board's lawyers have been investigating your background very thoroughly. They're prepared to file criminal charges if they can prove you deliberately manipulated me for financial gain. Daniel felt cold despite the morning warmth. On what basis? They've documented every visit to my home, every meal we've shared, every moment I've spent working alongside you, instead of managing from an executive office. They're characterizing our friendship as a calculated scheme to exploit an elderly woman's loneliness and wealth. The accusation was so contrary to reality that Daniel struggled to respond. Their partnership had evolved naturally from mutual respect and shared values. Eleanor's presence in his life had enriched it immeasurably, but not financially. If anything, the restoration project had delayed his search for stable employment. Eleanor, you know that's not true. Of course I know it's not true. But truth and legal strategy are different things. If we can't prove the project's business value, they'll argue that my irrational support for it demonstrates I was under your influence. Aaron approached them as they talked. What's wrong? Eleanor summarized the legal threat, watching Aaron's face cycle through confusion, anger, and determination. They're saying Dad took advantage of you? They're saying whatever they think will help them win, Eleanor replied. The truth is less important than the narrative they can construct. Aaron's jaw tightened with resolve. Then we make sure they don't win. The three of them walked toward the factory in silence, each carrying the weight of everything they stood to lose. The morning air was crisp with approaching autumn, and the industrial buildings stood silhouetted against the brightening sky like monuments to human ingenuity and perseverance. As they entered the workshop, they found it already bustling with activity. Marcus Washington was reviewing production schedules with Sarah Chen. Tommy Kowalski was training 2 new apprentices on safety protocols. Jimmy and the other young workers were preparing for their morning lessons with an enthusiasm that reminded Daniel why the project mattered beyond profit margins. "Listen up, everyone," Daniel called, gathering the group around a central workbench. "We need to talk about where we stand and what the next 5 days are going to require from all of us." He explained the situation without minimizing its severity: the hostile takeover attempt, the need to prove immediate profitability, the timeline that would demand everything they had to give. "So we're fighting for our lives," Marcus summarized when Daniel finished. "We're fighting for our vision," Eleanor corrected, "for the idea that work can be meaningful, that experience has value, that teaching young people skilled trades is an investment rather than an expense." Sarah raised her hand. "What do you need from us?" "Everything," Daniel replied honestly. "Extended hours, perfect quality, absolute commitment to deadlines that are probably impossible but that we're going to meet anyway." Tommy grinned. "Sounds like the old days when Henry would get a rush order and we'd all pull together to make it happen." "Exactly like the old days," Eleanor said, "except this time, instead of impressing one customer, we're trying to save the entire company." Jimmy Kowalski spoke up from the group of apprentices. "What happens to us if you lose?" Eleanor met his eyes directly. "You'll have to find other ways to learn the skills you want to master. But you'll always know that you were part of something important, something that honored the dignity of skilled work." Aaron stepped forward. "We're not going to lose. We're going to work harder than we've ever worked, produce better results than anyone thinks possible, and prove that this program isn't just about nostalgia, it's about the future." The group dispersed to their tasks with renewed purpose, and Daniel felt the familiar satisfaction of leading people who believed in what they were building together. But beneath the satisfaction lay a gnawing worry about the impossible timeline they'd committed to and the consequences of failure for everyone he cared about. 5 days, he murmured to himself. 5 days, Eleanor echoed, to prove that kindness and competence can coexist profitably. They had work to do. The original company charter lay beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the Witcom manufacturing boardroom, like evidence in a trial that would determine everyone's future. Eleanor had discovered the document in Henry's safe the night before, and its yellowed pages contained language that could either save their vision or be dismissed as the naive idealism of a different era. Daniel straightened his tithe, the same one he'd worn to his mother's funeral 5 years earlier, and tried to calm his racing heart. Through the conference room's windows, he could see the factory buildings where Aaron and the other apprentices were working their regular shifts, unaware that their future was being decided by 8 executives in expensive suits. Board Chairman Richard Hastings called the meeting to order at exactly 9 o'clock, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. At 63, Hastings possessed the lean efficiency of a corporate lawyer who had never worked with his hands but understood power with mathematical precision. "We're here to address Mrs. Whitcomb's fitness to continue managing company operations." Hastings began consulting papers that Daniel recognized as the hostile takeover documents. The evidence suggests a pattern of declining judgment that threatens shareholder interests and company viability. Eleanor sat at the far end of the polished table, looking smaller than Daniel had ever seen her, but maintaining the quiet dignity that had sustained her through 40 years of business challenges. She dressed carefully for the occasion, a navy suit that spoke of competence without ostentation, jewelry that suggested prosperity without excess. "Before we proceed," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the stakes, "I'd like to present information that provides context for recent decisions regarding the restoration project." Hastings checked his agenda with obvious impatience. "Mrs. Whitcombe, we've already reviewed the financial impact of your experimental programs. The numbers speak for themselves." "With respect, Richard, the numbers tell only part of the story. I'd like to share the complete picture." Daniel watched the other board members, 6 men and 2 women who had inherited their positions through business connections rather than manufacturing experience. They represented investment firms, consulting companies, and financial institutions that viewed Witcom manufacturing as a portfolio asset rather than a community anchor. Eleanor opened the charter document and began reading in a clear voice. "Witcom manufacturing is founded on the principle that business success should benefit all stakeholders, workers, customers, suppliers, and shareholders alike. The company commits to providing meaningful employment, quality products, and community leadership that honors the dignity of skilled labor." Board member Catherine Walsh interrupted. "Mrs. Whitcombe, those founding principles are admirable but not legally binding business strategy. We have fiduciary responsibilities that supersede sentimental attachments to outdated operational models." "Are they outdated?" Eleanor asked. "Or have we simply forgotten their value?" She gestured toward Daniel. "I'd like Mr. Brooks to present the operational results from our restoration pilot program." Daniel stood, his hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. He'd spent the weekend preparing a presentation that combined hard data with human stories, determined to make the board understand what they were considering destroying. 3 months ago, this company laid off experienced workers to reduce immediate costs. Daniel began. "The restoration program has brought 12 of those workers back, part-time, along with 5 apprentices who are learning skills that will serve them for decades." He distributed copies of production reports that Sarah Chen had helped him compile. "Quality metrics show 0 defects in our first major contract fulfillment. Productivity per worker hour exceeds industry standards by 15%. Customer satisfaction ratings are perfect." Board member James Morisono, relation to the automotive company they'd contracted, studied the numbers with obvious skepticism. "Mr. Brooks, these results come from a very small sample size, operating under experimental conditions. They don't prove scalability or long-term sustainability." "Actually, they do," Daniel replied, producing his second set of documents. "We've secured contracts worth $1.2 million over the next 18 months. Morrison Automotive has committed to a series of transmission housing orders. Peterson Aerospace wants us to bid on precision component work that requires exactly the kind of specialized skills our apprentices are developing." The room fell silent as board members reviewed the contract details. Daniel could see surprise and concern warring on their surprise that the restoration project had generated genuine revenue, concerned that their hostile takeover might be premature. Hastings leaned forward. These contracts assume production capabilities you don't currently possess. How do you propose to fulfill orders of this magnitude with part-time workers and inexperienced apprentices? Eleanor answered before Daniel could respond. By expanding the program systematically, by bringing back more experienced workers, by training additional apprentices, by proving that investment in people generates better returns than investment in cost-cutting measures. At what cost? Walsh demanded. The initial restoration expenses have already exceeded budget projections. Daniel felt the moment crystallizing around a fundamental choice between two visions of business success. He thought about Aaron, learning skills that connected him to generations of craftsmen. About Jimmy Kowalski, discovering talents he'd never known he possessed. About Marcus Washington and the other experienced workers who had rediscovered purpose in mentoring rather than merely producing. The cost, Daniel said quietly, is less than you think, and the return is greater than you can measure. He reached into his folder and withdrew a single piece of paper, crumpled and faded, but carefully preserved. This is the receipt from the night I paid for Mrs. Whitcomb's prescription. $38. That's what started everything we've accomplished together. The room was completely silent now, all attention focused on the small piece of paper that represented the intersection of need and generosity. You want to know about costs and returns? Daniel continued. That $38 investment has generated contracts worth over $1 million, restored 12 jobs, created 5 apprenticeships, and proved that this company's founding principles aren't outdated, they're essential. He looked directly at each board member in turn. The question isn't whether we can afford to continue the restoration program. The question is whether we can afford to stop it. The $38 pharmacy receipt lay in the center of the boardroom table, like David's stone facing Goliath small, seemingly insignificant, but carrying the power to topple giants. Daniel watched the board members' faces as they processed his words, seeing calculation replace skepticism in some eyes, while others hardened with corporate resolve. Richard Hastings broke the silence with the measured tone of someone accustomed to dismissing emotional appeals. Mr. Brooks, while your personal story is touching, business decisions cannot be based on sentimental attachments. This board has a legal obligation to maximize shareholder value, not to provide therapy for displaced workers. Therapy? Daniel's voice carried controlled anger. Learning precision machining is therapy. Training young people in skills that will employ them for life is therapy. Creating products that meet aerospace quality standards is therapy? Eleanor stood, her presence commanding attention despite her small stature. Richard, may I remind you that I am not just the founder of this company, I am also its largest shareholder. When you speak of maximizing shareholder value, you're speaking primarily of maximizing my value. Precisely why your judgment has become questionable, board member Catherine Walsh interjected. You're too emotionally invested to make rational financial decisions. Or perhaps, Eleanor replied calmly, I understand the true sources of long-term value better than people who measure success exclusively in quarterly reports. Daniel pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Aaron, are you and Jimmy available to join us in the boardroom? Yes, now. Hastings looked alarmed. Mr. Brooks, this is a closed board meeting. We cannot have unauthorized personnel. They're not unauthorized. Eleanor interrupted. Aaron Brooks and Jimmy Kowalski are representatives of the apprenticeship program. The board should hear directly from the people whose futures you're deciding. 3 minutes later, Aaron and Jimmy entered the boardroom, both wearing clean work shirts and carrying themselves with the confidence that comes from meaningful work. Daniel felt proud, seeing how the restoration project had transformed them. Aaron had grown into a natural leader, while Jimmy had shed the uncertainty of a young man with no clear direction. Gentlemen, Eleanor said, please tell the board about your experience in the apprenticeship program. Aaron stepped forward, his voice clear and steady. 3 months ago, I was planning to start college without any real understanding of how the things I might design would actually be manufactured. The apprenticeship program has taught me that engineering without hands-on knowledge is just theoretical mathematics. He gestured toward Jimmy. Jimmy couldn't afford technical school, but he's discovered he has exceptional spatial intelligence and manual dexterity. In 3 months, he's progressed from knowing nothing about machining to operating complex equipment with precision that impresses workers with decades of experience. Board member James Morrison consulted his notes. "What's your employment value after 3 months of training?" Jimmy answered with quiet confidence. "Peterson Aerospace has offered me a full-time position starting at $42,000 annually, with advancement potential based on skill development rather than just time served." The number clearly surprised several board members. Entry-level manufacturing positions in the region typically paid half that amount. "More importantly," Aaron continued, "we're learning from people like Marcus Washington and Sarah Chen Craftsman, whose knowledge will be lost forever if it's not passed down to the next generation." Eleanor opened Henry's business journal to a page she'd marked with a yellow sticky note. "Henry wrote something in 1985 that applies directly to our current situation. The board sees apprentices as a cost center, but they're actually our most valuable investment. Every skilled worker we train becomes a permanent asset whose knowledge compounds over decades." She looked directly at Hastings. "Richard, your father was on the board when Henry wrote those words. The apprenticeship program, your generation of executives eliminated in 1998, had produced some of our most valuable employees." "That was a different economy," Hastings replied defensively. "Was it?" Daniel asked. "Or did we just forget that skilled work has intrinsic value regardless of economic conditions?" Aaron spoke up again. "Mr. Hastings, with respect, the skills we're learning can't be outsourced or automated. Precision machining, custom fabrication, quality control, these require human judgment, experience, and pride in craftsmanship." Eleanor moved to the window, overlooking the factory floor, where the afternoon shift was beginning. "This vote isn't really about the restoration program's financial viability. The numbers prove it's profitable. This vote is about what kind of company Witcom Manufacturing will be own that serves quarterly reports or one that serves human potential." She turned back to face the board. "Henry and I built this company on the belief that business could be a force for good in people's lives. We proved that treating workers well generates better products, more loyal customers, and sustainable profits." Catherine Walsh raised her hand. "Mrs. Whitcombe, assuming the restoration program continues, what guarantees do we have that costs won't spiral beyond control?" Daniel answered before Eleanor could respond. "The same guarantee Henry gave your predecessors 40 years ago: careful management, transparent accounting, and measurable results. We're not asking for blank checks. We're asking for the opportunity to prove that investment in people generates returns that balance sheets can't capture." Hastings called for a brief recess, and the board members huddled in whispered conversation while Daniel, Eleanor, Aaron, and Jimmy waited in tense silence. When the meeting resumed, Hastings' expression was unreadable. "The board has reviewed the evidence and testimony presented today. We're prepared to vote on the motion to remove Mrs. Whitcombe from operational control and terminate the restoration program." Eleanor reached across the table and took Daniel's hand, a gesture of mutual support that had sustained them through months of uncertainty. "All in favor of the motion?" Hastings asked. Daniel held his breath as hands slowly rose around the table. 6 months later, the new company sign gleamed in the morning sunlight. Witcom, Brooks Manufacturing, its fresh paint reflecting the transformation that had swept through the entire facility. Daniel stood in the parking lot, coffee mug in hand, watching the day shift arrive, with the satisfaction of someone who had helped resurrect something precious from the edge of extinction. The board vote had been closer than anyone anticipated, 5-4, in favor of continuing the restoration program, with Eleanor retaining operational control by the narrowest possible margin. Catherine Walsh and two other members had surprised everyone by voting against the hostile takeover, swayed by the combination of solid financial projections and testimonials from Aaron and Jimmy. "The numbers don't lie," Walsh had said after the vote. "And neither do the young people whose futures we're shaping." Now, Aaron emerged from Building 3, wearing a supervisor's shirt and carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found his calling earlier than most. At 20, he'd completed his year-long apprenticeship with distinction and chosen to defer college for another year to help expand the program before pursuing his engineering degree. "Morning, Dad," Aaron said, joining Daniel in the parking lot. "The Peterson Aerospace order shipped yesterday, perfect quality, 2 days ahead of schedule. They want to discuss a long-term contract for precision components." Daniel smiled, remembering the desperate timeline they'd faced during the board crisis. What had seemed impossible then had become routine excellence through careful planning and dedicated craftsmanship. "How's Jimmy doing with the new apprentices?" "Like a natural teacher. Yesterday, I watched him explain threading operations to Maria Santos with the same patience Marcus showed him 6 months ago. The knowledge is passing down exactly the way it should." The apprenticeship program had grown beyond Eleanor's most optimistic projections. 18 young people were currently enrolled, with a waiting list that stretched into the following year. More importantly, the graduates were finding employment throughout the region's manufacturing sector, carrying Witcom Brooks training standards to companies that had forgotten the value of skilled craftsmanship. Eleanor approached from the direction of her car, moving with the energetic step of someone who had rediscovered purpose in her 70s. She'd insisted on the hyphenated company name, despite Daniel's protests, claiming it reflected their equal partnership in rebuilding something Henry would have been proud to see. "The bank called this morning," Eleanor announced with obvious satisfaction. "They want to discuss expansion financing. Apparently, our debt-to-revenue ratio has impressed them sufficiently to offer better terms than we originally requested." The financial turnaround had been dramatic but sustainable. Contracts with Morrison Automotive, Peterson Aerospace, and 4 smaller manufacturers had generated steady revenue that justified every dollar invested in restoration and training. More significantly, the quality of their work had attracted customers willing to pay premium prices for craftsmanship that exceeded industry standards. Speaking of expansion, Daniel said, "Marcus thinks we should consider adding a welding program. He's identified 12 experienced welders who lost jobs when Consolidated Steel closed last year." Eleanor consulted her ever-present notebook. "Space shouldn't be a problem. Building 5 has been sitting empty since we consolidated operations. What kind of timeline are we looking at?" 6 months to set up equipment and safety systems, another 6 months to establish the curriculum and recruit the first class of apprentices. As they walked toward the factory entrance, Daniel noticed details that still filled him with quiet pride. The parking lot was full again, not just with employee cars, but with delivery trucks from suppliers who competed for their business. The windows sparkled with professional cleaning. The landscaping around the buildings showed the care of people who viewed their workplace as something worth maintaining. Inside Building 3, the morning shift was settling into routines that had become second nature. The restored vintage lathe hummed alongside modern CNC machines, creating a harmony between traditional craftsmanship and contemporary efficiency. Young apprentices worked beside experienced mentors in an atmosphere of mutual respect and shared purpose. Jimmy Kowalski approached them, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone comfortable with responsibility. "Mrs. Whitcombe, the quality control numbers for last week are exceptional 99.7% first-pass acceptance, with the few rejections caused by material defects rather than machining errors." "Outstanding," Eleanor replied. "How are the new apprentices adjusting?" "Better than expected. Maria Santos has natural talent for precision work, and David Kim asks the kind of questions that show he's thinking beyond just following procedures." Daniel watched Jimmy discuss production schedules with the authority of someone who had grown from uncertain teenager to confident supervisor in less than a year. The transformation reminded him why the apprenticeship program mattered beyond job training. It was about helping people discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Aaron joined their conversation, consulting his own clipboard. "Dad, the community college wants to formalize our partnership. They're proposing to offer associate degrees in advanced manufacturing that would combine our hands-on training with their academic coursework." "Interesting idea," Daniel mused. "Students could earn college credit while learning skilled trades." Eleanor's eyes lit up with familiar enthusiasm. Henry always believed education should connect theory with practice. This could be exactly the kind of innovation he would have supported. As the morning progressed, Daniel found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The desperate night when Eleanor's card was declined seemed like a lifetime ago, yet he could still remember the exact weight of those $38 in his wallet and the moment of decision that had changed everything. The transformation hadn't been without challenges, integrating new workers with different backgrounds and expectations, managing growth while maintaining quality standards. Balancing the human elements, Eleanor valued with the financial disciplines the board demanded. But each challenge had been met by people who understood they were building something larger than individual success. At noon, Daniel walked to Henry's preserved office, where Eleanor often worked when she wanted to feel connected to the company's founding vision. She looked up from Henry's journal, which had become her constant companion during decision-making moments. "Any wisdom from Henry today?" Daniel asked. Eleanor smiled, pointing to an entry from 1979. "Success isn't measured by how much money you make, but by how many lives you improve while making it. Every worker who finds dignity in their job, every apprentice who discovers their potential, every customer who receives quality they can trust, these are the real metrics of a business worth building." Daniel looked through the office windows at the bustling factory floor, where people of different generations work together with shared purpose and mutual respect. "I think he'd be proud of what we've accomplished." "I think he'd be proud of what we're still going to accomplish," Eleanor corrected. "This is just the beginning." Outside, the afternoon shift was arriving, and Daniel could see the future in their face-experienced workers who had rediscovered meaning in their skills, young apprentices who were building lives around craftsmanship, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from work that matters. The small act of kindness that had started it all, paying for a stranger's medicine, had grown into something neither he nor Eleanor could have imagined. But perhaps that was the point. Genuine goodness compounds in ways that can't be predicted or calculated, creating value that extends far beyond the original investment. As Daniel returned to his work, he carried with him the certainty that some investments in human dignity yield returns that last for generations.